It really is a pleasure. I've been waiting for this for a long time. I've known Nathan for about 30 years. Is that right? 30?
Just about.
We met when we were both accepted at a workshop at Michigan State University, and Nathan lived close enough to give me a ride. So my first experience of Nathan was about 14 hours in the car with a stranger, which can go bad. But in this case, it went very well, and we ended up being roommates when we got there. We've been close friends ever since. I have probably read, well, most everything Nathan's written that he's willing to show publicly anyway. Those works include the series of short stories that you all may know as North American Lake Monsters, which was adapted for the Hulu series Monsterland. They include, right there, right?
Yeah.
They include a second collection of short stories named Wounds, which was one of the stories, The Visible Filth, was adapted. Also, it's available on Hulu as the movie Wounds. And that that book is soon to be re-released under its proper title, The Atlas of Hell. And now Nathan has a new novel, his first novel coming out, Strange. Nathan has been talking about this book and working on this book for a long time. It's been my pleasure to read bits and pieces of it as it comes along. And it was my pleasure when it was done to read the whole thing and see how spectacularly those bits and pieces fit together. Nathan has won the Shirley Jackson Award. He's been nominated for the Shirley Jackson Award many times. Am I missing awards?
No.
Nathan has won the Shirley Jackson Award, but he's been nominated a lot of times as well. He's been nominated for the World Fantasy Award. So that's my off-the-cuff introduction of Nathan, and now you will have my off-the-cuff questions for Nathan. I hope this will be more of a conversation.
We'll see.
We'll see. The book The Strange is, for those of you who don't know, set on the planet Mars. The planet Mars has a breathable atmosphere, as we all know. And it has been billed as a combination of True Grit and Ray Bradbury and a Western. On a Mars like Ray Bradbury's, where you can breathe and go about your normal life in many ways, except life on this Mars is not normal. It's kind of strange. So I was wondering first if I could ask you, why Mars?
Well, I've been fascinated by Mars since I was a little kid. I remember sitting outside and looking at the sky and at the moon, and the fact that I could see Mars was always kind of incredible to me. And it was always became a kind of, it was a kind of a romantic setting in my mind since I was very small. And so it just seemed inevitable to me that I would eventually want to write about that and kind of tap into that feeling of this kind of like romantic possibility that Mars presents. And and as far as the breathable atmosphere and things like this goes, it was the Mars that's in this book and the Mars that I care about is not at all the real Mars. It's not. I didn't worry at all about scientific accuracy, about plausibility of any sort. It was just completely a country of the imagination, because that's the Mars that I fell in love with. It was a product of my own imaginings about what it might be like, or the stories that I read about it from people like Ray Bradbury or Edgar Rice Burroughs. various other writers. And it was a place I wanted to go and spend some time in.
Well, that reminds me of your narrator, Annabelle Chris,
Mhm.
who is 14, and she is very devoted to pulp fiction.
Yep.
And early in the book, she says that she loved to read about these adventures in pulp fiction, but then she had one of her own. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what you mean by pulp fiction. The question I really have is, it seems kind of sacred to Annabelle. Is it that way to you?
Yeah, I think so in some ways. For Annabelle, the pulp fiction was literally what we think of as pulp fiction at that time. It was dime store novels. It was stories in magazines, like the kind you'd find in Weird Tales or Argosy, things like that. And Annabelle was much like myself at that age, kind of very insular, lives much in her own world, and is kind of she finds it difficult to make friends, and so spends a lot of time in her own imagination. And so these stories and the characters that she encounters in these stories are as real to her as, or more real sometimes, than the people that she deals with in her life. That's where she escapes. That's where she gets a sense of structure and morality that she can understand and identify with. And yeah, I think it is sacred to her, although she wouldn't think of it in those terms. I certainly didn't at the time. But the imagination as a place to retreat from the problems around you in your normal life is sacred to me. Was at the time, and
It still is.
And it was interesting in this case to take a character whose understanding of the world is filtered through those kinds of stories, and that understanding of the world, and have her collide with the more complicated, morally complex situations we find ourselves in, as we go through actual life. And so she embarks upon a quest, a journey with one understanding that doesn't really hold up to the actual life experience that she finds herself in.
No, she finds herself in a much more complex world than she thinks she's going to. When you think about pulp fiction as a kind of holy space, what does it mean when Annabelle encounters a world where it is much more morally complex, and yet this is in many ways a book that is inhabited by all the attributes we associate with pulp fiction, many of the tropes, and many of the adventure-driven sort of narratives.
Mm-hmm. Well, I wanted to honor both of them. I mean, as you mentioned just a moment ago, the idea of it being sacred. It's the idea of these stories as being places of pure imagination, where the rules are out the window and you can be as over the top is kind of bonkers as you want to be in some of these stories. The ludicrousness of them, or the implausibility of some of them, is a great deal of their appeal. And so there's that, but going along with them, at least traditionally, is the very simple kind of moral code. Often they reinforce very strict moral ideas of what is right and what is wrong, who is good, who is bad, that kind of thing. And so I wanted to get in there and engage with those things that are so much fun to me, that were then and still are now. Just letting the imagination just off the chain, and not worrying about plausibility, not worrying about anything about what Mars might really be like. And yet take the simplicity of those stories and just complicate them, because that to me is what's interesting about character, about literature, about stories in general, is just taking these people and making them having their ideas, their preconceptions of how the world is challenged and changed.
Annabelle is very much a a real person in that sense. She's very complex. And when she leaves the town where she is living, she's born on Earth, but when she leaves the town that she is living, she enters into that strange world. And that's the title of your book. What is the strange, if you can talk about that without giving too much away?
Yeah, so in the context of the story itself, the strange is a mineral. Its colloquial name in the book is the strange. It is something that they harvest from Mars, in which they put into machines that kind of gives them the illusion of intelligence. Basically, they're making robots. And it gives these robots, which they call engines in the story, the illusion of personality. They don't really have personalities, not actually self-aware, but they can mimic it to such a degree that they seem well enough, they seem real enough to the people that they engage with. And at some point in the story, she finds out what it actually is, and it's something that's a bit more, I'm not sure if this is saying too much now or not, but essentially it's much more about what Mars is and Mars's own actual sort of self-awareness. And so they're taking something fundamental to the planet itself.
It's strange. You don't want to give too much away.
All right, I'll stop. Yeah, but it's the crux on which the plot turns, not necessarily her development, but the plot itself.
One thing I found fascinating about the book was it seems to reflect the path of your career. You started in many ways as a very, this may be the wrong word, a realistic writer, setting horror stories in a very realistic world that is character driven in a way we might associate with a writer like Raymond Carver. With Wounds, The Atlas of Hell, you began to move away from that into a world that was still associated with the weird and with the dark, pirates, more into a kind of adventure fiction that was tinged with horror, or a horror fiction that was tinged with adventure. And here you're moving into science fiction tropes, but deployed in a very unusual way. It's, like you said, not a science fiction novel. How do you account for that kind of move in your own career from blue collar realism with monsters to more and more pulp fiction?
I don't know if I have a real answer to that. Part of it is more confidence. The more I became confident in my ability to write a decent story, the more I stopped worrying about getting a little stranger in the materials I was drawing from. Just part of it was just having more fun. It's fun to write about cannibals and pirates and people on Mars, and also my interests are changing. I think all of us, our interests evolve, and what we care about and what we're engaged with changes as we get older and experience life more. And I felt I had said whatever I had wanted to say about, more realistic, grounded fiction and that blue collar kind of aesthetic with the first book. And I didn't want to keep telling the same stories over and over. I would bore myself, and if I'm boring myself, then I'm probably boring anybody who reads it. So it was really just, it was just that. Yeah, I always, the analogy I always think of when I think about these kinds of questions is I'm just taking a bucket, lowering it down the well, and whatever comes up, that's the stuff that I'm making stories out of. And it seems like a different kind of water all the time. And this time I put the bucket down there, and this is the stuff that came up. And so this is what I worked with. And there's not really, any kind of guiding principle behind it. It's just the things that come.
you're thought of usually as a horror writer.
That's, yeah.
That's sort of the label you got hung with anyway. Is this a horror novel?
No, it's not. But there's horror in it. I think genre isn't a thing. I don't sit down, and maybe this is true of most writers, I don't know. I don't sit down and think I'm going to write a horror story, or I'm going to write a dark fantasy, or I'm going to write a science fiction story. I just think I'm going to write this particular story. And the genre elements that are used, they're just tools. Horror is a tool to tell a story. It's not the thing. It's not the thing to be serviced. It is the thing that services the story.
The story is a boss.
Yeah. So it has horror elements in it. I think those kinds of things will probably always be in whatever I write, because I just love I love that tool. It's something that appeals to me in a very visceral level, but it's not the only tool in the box, and it's not always the appropriate one.
Right. Do you foresee yourself returning to Mars? Because you create what at first seems like a very small world, and it keeps expanding as Annabelle's understanding of the world changes, and you leave a lot of this world unexplored.
Right. Yeah, maybe part of the principle, part of what I wanted to do with this book was play with the idea that all questions don't get answered. A lot of times, most of the times, I think we have questions in our lives that we just have to live with never knowing the answer to. And this is something that Annabelle has to learn in the story. And some of those questions are, what else is in this world? Who are the other people here? And yeah, so those are open questions. And I like to leave some of those questions because for a reader, the hope is that will feel like a living world, like a thing that exists beyond the boundaries of the page they're reading. And possibly I'll go back and explore some of them. Maybe not. It was not written with the intention of going back, but there is that. There's always the chance.
There's lots of room to explore.
There's a lot of room.
I found it to be an absolutely riveting read. I really, really loved it. Would you read some of it now?
Sure.
All right. I'm going to step out and let you do that.
Okay.
Thank you.
So I'm going to read from the first chapter of the book. As Dale mentioned, it takes place on Mars. It takes place in the early 1930s. And I think that's all you have to know to get started. So I was 13 when the silence came to Mars, settling over us like a smothering dust. We don't talk about those days much anymore, and most who lived through them are dead. I'm old now, extravagantly old, I like to say, but I'll join them soon enough. Maybe that's why I find myself thinking back on those years more frequently in the night's long hours. The terror and the loneliness that afflicted us all, and the shameful things we did because we were afraid. Maybe that's why I've been thinking too about old friends and old enemies, about how sometimes they're the same people. And maybe that's why dear old Watson has come back to visit me at last, gleaming in the lamplight, full of his own enchanted tales. All of my life, I've wanted to write adventure stories, but I've always been more suited to reading than to writing. I never believed my imagination was up to the task. It's only now, close to the end, that I realize I've never had to imagine one. My name is Annabelle Crispin. This is the story of what happened to me, what I did about it, and the consequences thereof. It was early evening and we were cleaning up the Mother Earth diner. Normally, my father liked to keep the place open well into the night. We'd been living with the silence for nearly a year, and during that time, it seemed that more and more people wanted a warm and bright place to be when darkness fell. My family was happy to provide that place. We specialized in good Southern cooking, beans and rice, collard greens, barbecued pork, that sort of thing. And we had our walls covered with pictures of famous Earth cities and landmarks. The silence imbued those photographs with an elegiac quality. It was true, but that only heightened their appeal. That night, we were closing earlier than usual. The Moving Picture Club was presenting a picture show in the town square, which would draw most of the folks away from us. That was fine with me. I was hoping to make it down to the square and see it myself. They were running The Lost World again, and though I'd seen it twice before, I was eager to go again. Arthur Conan Doyle was my favorite writer. In my excitement, I was rereading the casebook of Sherlock Holmes, his spine cracked from the love I had shown it. Joe Riley was our last customer of the evening. He was despised by many in New Galveston, and it was his habit to come in when he was most likely to remain undisturbed. I would have been happy to bar him entry altogether, but Father wouldn't have it. So I served him with curt silence. He ate quickly, wolfishly, and said, "You closing early tonight, Annabelle?" "You know we are." "Well, I guess I ought to let you get to it." He laid down his money and headed out. It was a relief. Usually he lingered. I brought the dishes to the back where Father and Watson, our engine, were cleaning up. Father had been talking under his breath and went quiet when I came back. He was talking to Mother again. I knew it gave him comfort, but it hurt to hear nonetheless. He tried to do it only when I wasn't around, but sometimes I guess he couldn't help himself. Watson was a kitchen engine, a bipedal construct, humanoid in form, utilitarian and featureless. I called him Watson after the character in the Sherlock Holmes stories, but he wasn't much more than a dishwashing program that my parents had overlaid with an inexpensive personality template, English butler, to amuse themselves and their customers. He was no more programmed to be a detective sidekick than I was raised to be the world's greatest amateur sleuth. It was just a lie I chose to believe in. I was only in the back for a minute, so when I returned to the dining area, I was surprised to see a man at the counter. He sat hunched over his clasped hands, studying the entanglement of his fingers like he might puzzle out some mystery there. The hair on his head was long and tangled, blonde, dusted with the soft pink shades of the low Martian desert. He wore one of the heavy weather jackets favored by the nomadic cults, protecting them from the fatal cold of the nights outside the city. A symbol branded onto the leather of his right sleeve identified him as one of the moths, named after the strange body harvesting moth native to Mars, the kind that nests in the dead. He raised his head to look at me, and I was struck by his face, which was beautiful in a hard, unforgiving way, the way a desert is beautiful. His eyes were pale green, faintly luminescent. I would have mistaken him for one of the miners, if not for the symbol on the jacket. I thought he must have been my father's age at least, somewhere in his 40s, until he spoke, and I heard the youth in his voice. I was beginning to think I was going to die out here before someone decided to disturb me. His rudeness surprised me. I did not know him, which was unusual in New Galveston, but not impossible, especially if he belonged to one of the desert cults. Still, my father and I were respected in the community and generally treated accordingly. "Sorry, but we're closed. Sign says open." I was about to turn it off. "But you ain't yet, so I guess you must be open. I'll take some black coffee." Not knowing what else to do, I turned around and put some water on the range to boil. It bothered me, this outsider coming in and delivering orders like that, and it bothered me even more that I obeyed. For a few minutes, there was nothing to do, so I leaned against the counter while he sat there watching me. I slid my book under the counter, not wishing to provide this man an opening to further conversation. I heard Father messing around in the back, cleaning the dishes and putting them up, talking to Mother. It was a quiet expression of grief, unremarkable and without harm. But now that this man heard it, I was embarrassed. "Who's back there?" the man said. "My father. This is his place." "Who's he talking to?" "Our engine," I said. The lie was easy by now. "He's a dishwasher." "Dishwasher, huh? So where's your mama?" "Earth." I felt the blood rush to my face. "So you help him run the place? He lets his little girl out here to deal with all the dissolute human scum that comes through these doors while he hides away doing women's work with the engines in the back?" "Our customers aren't scum. Generally, they are more polite than you are." "Well, I'm sorry if I offend. If you were really sorry, you would collect yourself and walk out that door. As I said, we're closed. They're showing a picture show in the square tonight, and I would like to see it." "Little girl, I have come from the desert. I am tired and I am in need of shelter and some pleasant company. But more than any of that, I am in need of hot coffee. And under this roof, I find I am able to acquire all of it at once. I ain't inclined to leave. The water started to whistle behind me and I poured it over the coffee grounds. Well, I'm not inclined to be very pleasant, I said. Yeah, you made that clear already. What are you so fired up to see, anyhow? They're showing the Lost World. Saying the words conjured the image of those beautiful dinosaurs, and I felt an unwelcome, childish thrill. He laughed and shook his head. I wished I hadn't answered him. Now I was ashamed as well as angry. When I poured the coffee into his mug, I allowed a generous portion of grounds to slide in with it. He said, ain't you seen it 100 times anyway? And won't you see it 100 times again? There won't be any more pictures coming from home now. What we got is what we got. I didn't answer him. It wasn't something I hadn't thought of before, but I still held on to the notion that maybe we could make new pictures somehow. Eventually, I held on to the notion that the interruption in our normal life we've been suffering under for so many months would soon be righted. All I needed was the application of hard work, reason, and mostly patience. The world moved according to a long-standing order, and it would come back as soon as people started acting regular again. I wouldn't trouble to argue the point, though. He had his cup of coffee, and as far as I could figure it, my obligation to him had reached its conclusion. 10 cents, I said. He wrapped his dirty hands around the cup and closed his eyes, breathing in the smell of it. That don't mean anything, he said. I felt my patience snap. It means you owe us 10 cents. You can't just force your way in here when we're trying to close and then not pay for what you order. He put down his mug gently and said, force? Little girl, calm yourself down. I will pay you when I'm ready to pay you. If you think money means a goddamn thing anymore, you're more childish than I thought. The old things don't matter. Don't you get that? I heard the door to the kitchen open behind me, and my father said, Belle, are you shouting? What's going on out here? Father looked tired. These days, he always did. He wasn't very tall, and he'd been thin even when in good health, but in the months since the silence started, he'd come to look almost skeletal. His hair had thinned to nothing on top, and what was left was mostly gray. His clothes, wet with water from washing dishes, hung loosely from his body. His face was worn. He was turning into an old man right in front of me. It was hard to look at him anymore without feeling a bewildering tangle of sadness and fear. I told this man to pay for his coffee, and he won't do it. He put his hand on my shoulder. Annabelle, it's just coffee, he said into my ear. To the dusty scavenger across the counter, he said, my daughter's headstrong. It's what keeps me honest. I bristled. He had no right to apologize for me, not when I was in the right. He offered the man a smile. If you did not know him, it might have seemed genuine. Your sign said open, said the man, as if my father had challenged him in some way. Of course, we're closing up, but you're welcome to stay and finish. Why don't you go ahead and shut it off? I don't mind staying open a while longer. To be honest, you're doing me a favor. I've got work to do here anyway, and I wouldn't mind the company. Father walked around the counter with his broom, ready to clean the main floor. I said, shut the sign off. Father stopped, turned to look at the man. Another surge of anger galloped through my blood. I was always hot-tempered, and it got me into trouble sometimes, but some folks brought it out. Some folks just needed to be hit in the face. I wanted Father to put him in his place. I wanted him to grab this intruder by his filthy collar and drag him kicking and hollering through the diner and throw him outside. I wanted him to blacken those pretty eyes, but it wasn't his way. He'd always been a mild soul. He liked tranquility, and he liked good manners. I used to wonder what it had been that caused such a delicate-natured man to volunteer to be one of the first permanent colonists on Mars those 10 years ago. Brave men did that sort of thing. My father was not brave. Mother was. All right, he said. He flicked his eyes to me and then back to the man. Just stay calm. I'll shut it off. I am calm, old man. I'll stay that way too, as long as you do what I say. Father walked to the sign hanging outside the window, and as he did this, I calculated my odds against this intruder. I had boiling water to hand, but it would take me 2 or 3 good strides to fetch it, another to turn around and fling it at him. That left him too much time. We'd taken the knives to the back to be washed. The fryer was off, the oil cooling. Watson remained in the back, scrubbing plates, as useless as a potted plant. So I glared fiercely at him. and I hoped his imagination was sufficient to interpret the magnitude of ills I visited upon him in my mind. The vacancy of his expression as he looked back at me suggested that it was not. Father pulled the cord on the neon sign. It sputtered and went out. He flipped a switch and half the interior lights went out too, leaving only the kitchen illuminated and a few emergency lights. He stayed quiet as he walked back around the counter until he stood behind me. There, he said, we're closed. Annabelle, go back in the kitchen. You just stay right where you are, Annabelle, the man said. Do as I say right now. I moved to obey, even though every impulse told me to stay. The man slapped his hand on the countertop. Do you not listen? Do you not? My father raised his voice too, but before I could parse what he was saying, the stranger removed a pistol from his belt, hidden beneath his coat, and with a grace and a practice I would not have attributed to one with such a rough aspect, he flipped it once in the air so that he held it by its barrel, and he brought it down in a vicious strike against my father's temple, dropping him to the counter like a sack of oats. Father slid to the floor. I tried to hold him up, but he was too heavy. The intruder had the gun by its grip again, the transition too fast for me to follow. Its open end pointed at my face. Now, goddamn it, you stay right there. I was terrified. I did not move. I watched my father bleeding quietly onto the floor, which was filthy from the treads of our feet and the sand blown in from outside. He was as still as a moon in the open sky. I'll stop there. And I think if anyone has any questions, I'll be happy to answer them or sign books if you don't. Yes, please.
I'd like to know more about your secret origins as far as science fiction goes. What other authors did you admire? Which ones helped you?
Well, as a kid, I read some science fiction, but surprisingly not much. I was much more interested in fantasy and dark fantasy and horror fiction, that kind of thing. I read, the influences on this one. Ray Bradbury, of course, was a big influence. Isaac Asimov with especially the stories about his robots and the question of sentience. Frank Herbert and Dune was definitely in the back of my mind. But with a lot of them, it was not so much the actual stories themselves as it was the idea I had in my head of what those stories might be, like stories I haven't read. I've read a few of the Asimov stories, but I haven't read a lot. But I remember staring at the book, at the images on the covers and the images on the covers. And this is true with Bradbury too. I was often captivated with the idea of Bradbury more than the actual stories. And so it was more my kind of this abstract notion of what those stories were that sort of fed into this, if that makes any sense. Maybe as much, the art on the covers of the books as what was actually inside the books.
This one's from an online audience from Grant Dow. I think it's cool that the novel is set in the 1930s. What drove you to make that decision?
So, I'm supposed to repeat the questions. I'm sorry. Audiences, it's cool that the novel is set in the 1930s, and why is that? I think there are a few things. I think I was reading a book called The Worst Hard Time, which is about the sandstorms and the Dust Bowl, and so that kind of aesthetic was very much in my mind. I was also, reading some westerns, books by Molly Gloss, Larry McMurtry, and of course Charles Portis, and so I think those kinds of things just kind of combined in my head. It just seemed like an appropriate. It just felt right. Is the real answer. It just felt like it was the right time for it. And I also just like retro science fiction too. I like the idea of it. I like the idea of. I think one of the reasons I like the idea of it is because it allows me to kind of like uncouple from the notion of scientific rigor. If I'm setting this in 1930s, obviously nothing is going to make sense. Obviously, we're not on Mars in the 1930s, and so I may as well make the air breathable. I may as well give it some rivers and some life. It just all kind of works together to free me a little bit. Yes, Sean.
Any plans to adapt this to a role-playing game system?
Any plans to adapt it to a role-playing game system? I wouldn't even know how to begin. That is so far outside my wheelhouse. If it happened, I'd be all for it. But I would definitely not be the one to do it. Yes.
Why is the atmosphere on Mars breathable? Was it because of human intervention, or is it just naturally in the story?
Why was the atmosphere on Mars breathable? Is it because of human intervention? No, it was because it's a fantasy world. This is billed as a science fiction novel, and it has all the trappings. It has the robots and the spaceships, but in my head, it's a fantasy. It's a dark fantasy. And so I worried about it in the earlier stages. Like I thought about, should I know when the moons are full and not? Should I know how quickly they orbit? Should I know how long it takes to go back and forth from Earth? I just got, every question was a stumbling block. And so I finally just said, none of it matters. It's a dream Mars. It's the Mars I had in my imagination when I was a kid, staring at it in the sky.
This one is from Imminence. There is a sort of decay, decline, or even descent into madness that takes place over the course of the strange. I wonder if that's a structural element you found important to this particular story.
There's a sort of descent into decay and madness throughout the course of the story. Is that a structural element that I found important when I was writing the story? Did I get that right? Not consciously, not overtly. I think that this is a place that the silence is a kind of a year-long and going lack of communication with Earth, and no one knows why. And so this is a society, a very small society that's trying to cope with this sudden separation. And so there's a lot of fear and panic, and that the element of the strange that they're taking out of the ground is having an effect on the people who are taking it out of the ground. This kind of driving them a little insane. And so it wasn't so much part of the structure anymore, beyond that it was just a necessary evolution of their continued exposure to it and their continued paranoia and grief as they're just trying to come to terms with living in a world in which they're bereft and they don't know why. They don't know what happened. They just have to just deal with it, and they're not dealing with it well. Anything else? Yeah.
Sound pretty calm about adaptation in general, and I know y'all opened up talking about your earlier work. Have there been any pleasant surprises with your work you care to speak to, where someone took it in a different direction than what you originally had?
Pleasant surprises in adaptations, when someone took it in a different direction? Yeah, a few. I've had two experiences. The novella, The Visible Filth, was turned into a film, and the short stories, a few of the short stories from North American Lake Monsters made up a series called Monsterland. And in both cases, and in the several cases in the series, there were diversions, taken from what I had written into what they decided to make it. And I find that process exciting. I know not every writer feels that way, but it's a different. My point of view on this is that it's a different medium. You're a different artist. Is taking your story for which they pay you, and they are putting their own spin on it. And so I think of it as variations on a theme. I think it's not something. I don't feel precious about what they're turning it into, because that's their thing. And part of this whole process is you respect who they are, and that they're bringing in a whole different psychological apparatus to it, and they're making a different story out of it. And it's fun to see what they do with it. Sometimes I think it's great. Sometimes I think I wouldn't have made that decision, but it doesn't matter. It's their thing now. Monsterland isn't mine; it's theirs. And it's an exciting process. It's invigorating. And for Monsterland in particular, I got to sit in the writer's room for a couple of weeks while they were hashing out all the storylines, what we're going to adapt, what we weren't going to adapt, what the new stories were going to be. And it was one of the most invigorating experiences, that I've had. It was just this very kinetic atmosphere where these 8 or 9 people were there, all throwing ideas constantly, and just twisting them around, batting them aside if they didn't immediately work. If something had some traction, they would play with it for a while and tease it out. And if that worked, great. If it didn't, they'd throw that aside too. It was very egoless and volcanic, in its intensity. And it was it was exciting to be a part of and just to watch. So yeah, there are a lot of pleasant surprises. I can't think of specific ones necessarily, but just the whole process was invigorating and a lot of fun. Yeah.
From a writing standpoint, how is writing short fiction different from writing a novel?
How is writing a short fiction different from writing a novel? There are probably a million answers to that question. The one that leaps to my mind first and foremost is that I found the process of writing a novel to be more pleasant. I got to spend more time with the characters, which is something that's becoming more important to me as I continue on this path. I'm less interested in creating like these little smaller faceted structures and much more interested in spending time with someone's psychology and just seeing how that evolves. There's more room to digress and pursue little side avenues, which is something I really enjoy as a writer. I just found it much more pleasant, actually. And I don't have many short story ideas anymore. The ones that are coming up in that bucket are longer ideas now. That's probably because I enjoy the psychology of a character more than I enjoy focusing on a particular moment or feeling like I did with short stories.
I want to applaud you for having a 14-year-old girl as your lead character, and she's amazing. I love her. And I was curious, I'm always like, when grown men can write great adolescent girl characters, I'm always like, that's completely amazing. And I know you have a daughter, but I was curious what made you decide to do a 14-year-old girl instead of a boy, especially when you talk about your dream of Mars when you were young. And were you inspired by, obviously by your daughter, but by any other characters that you've read or seen in a movie?
So the question is, why did I choose a 14-year-old girl rather than a 14-year-old boy to be the point of view character? And was I inspired by other characters that I've read? Mostly I chose her because of my own daughter. When the idea first occurred to me, my daughter was a teenager. She was a little bit older than the one in the book is, but I was, like many parents probably, I worry a lot about what her life is going to be like after I'm not here. And the world changes so fast. And I just think, what's she going to do? Is she going to be okay? Is she going to, how is she going to do? And so I just thought about, exploring that idea of someone, a young girl, who's the whole world is shifting underneath her, and things that she thought were real are not real. Everything she understood to be true turns out not to be exactly what she thought. So yeah, it was my kid. That's why. And as far as other characters, it's funny. I did have a particular voice in my head when I was writing her. The actress Caitlin Deaver was in a show called Justified. She herself was a teenager, I think. And in my mind, as I was writing, I was kind of channeling that energy. I had her voice in my mind. And so she was probably more of an influence than I realized at the time.
So this is from the online audience, and it's from David Rochelle. Who are some of your favorite up-and-coming writers people should be looking out for?
Favorite up-and-coming writers people should be looking out for. Well, especially in the horror genre, there are a few coming up that are really kind of exciting. Eric LaRocca is one that is creating a lot of waves, an excellent writer. Haley Piper is another one. Just very kind of kinetic, exciting fiction coming from a very different perspective than we're typically used to, and bringing some fresh energy. Zen Rockland is a writer coming up. They're also, bringing just a different perspective. Not the old white guy perspective like mine, but different avenues into the genre and new life. Those are the ones that come immediately to mind.
So we have time for one more question. Anybody want to take a hit? Anybody?
Oh,
All right. I know your inspiration for this started many years before the pandemic, but I wondered how that and the last few years of life, how that impacted your writing of this book.
How did the pandemic last few years of my life, or our lives, impact this book? I don't think the pandemic did consciously. I'm sure it worked its way in there in ways that I'm not totally aware of. However, the stratifying political environment that we all find ourselves dealing with did. The notion that the people who you once thought were just your friendly neighbors maybe weren't as friendly as you thought. The stability that you kind of counted on, the sort of foundational societal stability, is much more or much less stable than you thought. That definitely played a role as Annabelle was trying to navigate her way through the way the people in her town react to what happens to her and what happens to her own family. So I think that definitely played a role. The pandemic itself, I'm not aware of what role it played. I'm sure it had something to do in there. So I really appreciate everyone coming out, who came here and showed up online. I really thank you so much. I don't know how to sign off except to say I'm very grateful.